Hello, my name is Souq. I'm the Academic Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. The following is one of a series of IEA Book Club webinars produced by the IEA. In this video, I'm in conversation with Mike Munger, Professor of Political Economy at Duke University, to discuss his forthcoming book for the IEA, Platforms, Perils and Promise, which look at the sharing economy in more detail. So now to our speaker. Mike Munger has worked at the US Federal Trade Commission and taught at Dartmouth University, the University of Texas, University of North Carolina, and now Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. He's the Director of Philosophy, Politics and Economics Program and a Professor in the Department of Economics and Political Science. Mike, thank you very much for joining us, for us this evening, for you this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you're about to say. I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me switch to my PowerPoint, which is a way of getting through this very quickly. I do want to thank the IEA for making this possible, because the genesis of this book project was entirely with the IEA. So let me say a little bit about the history of IEA and transactions costs. The two gentlemen that you see here are R.H. Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991, and Douglas North, one of my dissertation advisors, who won the Nobel Prize in 1993. I had read Coase, of course, even as an undergraduate, but in graduate school, Douglas North really emphasized the importance of Coase and transaction costs. Now, at my dissertation defense, it's an economic dissertation defense, a somewhat daunting affair. Doug North asked me a question, and I did what all economists do when they don't know the answer. I went to the board and started drawing equations. Now, to be fair, economists also do that when they think they do know the answer, so it's a good camouflage technique. After about 2 minutes of excruciating silence, finally, Douglas North raised his hand and looked at me and interrupted and said, in a voice that you might use to address a well-loved but not terribly bright child, "Michael, the answer is transactions cost. The answer to my question is transactions cost." And it took me a while to realize, but for Douglas North, the answer to every important question, all these different questions, it's always the same. It's transaction costs. And actually, that's a pretty good first start. Now, later in their lives, both Coase and North, after they won Nobel Prizes, began thinking about larger social problems. And the genesis of my project today actually was at the Think conference in 2015 in London with IEA. And one of the results of that was a very nice publication about the sort of contemporary importance of R.H. Coase. And in it, I wrote a paper. In that book, I wrote a preliminary paper that in some ways has become this book. Remember that Coase's question was, if markets are so great, you economists always jabbering about prices and the way markets organize things, if markets are so great, why are there firms? Because firms, after all, expressly suppress the workings of the market mechanism. And I think you know what the answer is, since that's a question. The answer is transaction costs, because that's the answer to every question. Now, I wondered, what would R.H. Coase say today about the following problem? And that is, why do we own so many things when it seems like it would be cheaper to rent or share them? Well, it's a different question, but the same answer, transactions cost. The reason why we own everything, remember, if you own something, you pay for it twice. First, you pay for the thing, and second, you pay to store it. I think that 50 years from now, people will look back and say, why were they not just so selfish, but stupid? Because we would buy these things and then keep them using space under lock and key to make sure that no one else got to use them. Whereas in fact, we could make do with a lot fewer things if we had some mechanism for sharing. And I mean sharing in a particular sense. Quite a bit of the book is devoted, of my book is devoted to the question of how to think about sharing, because it's not sharing in the usual communal ownership way. It's serial temporal control. That is, I get it for now, you get it later, but at the time, each of us has exclusive use. Well, the basic Coasean insight is like a pair of scissors, and it's the interaction between two things. Division of labor, which is the reason why economies of scale mean we need organizations, that individual artisanal production doesn't do as well as division of labor, because there's a nonlinearity in the production function. If we can divide and specialize, we can produce a lot more. And as Adam Smith talked about in the first 5 chapters of the wealth of nations, that really is the origin of wealth, or what he called opulence. The second thing is transactions cost, because division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, but it's also limited by optimal firm size. And the size of the organization that we can manage is going to be limited by transactions cost. Now, the fundamental Northian insight, my particular take on this, is that transactions cost is primarily an institutional phenomenon. Now, obviously, Coase thought that also. But what's important about institutions is that institutions are often designed to reduce transactions cost in particular ways. So Coase's notion was that transactions costs are going to depend on institutions. North's claim was that many political and economic institutions are designed to reduce or affect transactions costs. So this book is about platforms, as the title suggests, and platforms are any institutional structure that solves the three main transaction cost problem. And I tried to think of a way of summarizing the main transactions cost problem. We just lost a giant of economist, Oliver Williamson. And Williamson had a whole large Jesuitical set of categories of transactions costs. So my three have the problem of oversimplification, but it's easier to remember. Triangulation means that you and I have to find each other. So usually if I say, I have a widget and you want a widget, then we can talk about us negotiating a price. But I don't know that you want a widget. You don't know that I have a widget. So most things are in the wrong place, and it's because they're in our closet or our storage unit. So finding each other and agreeing on some kind of price is triangulation. Transfer is the actual delivery or carrying out of the contract, and the payment of whatever money or exchange we're considering. Trust is the ability to rely on the promise of other people without expending a lot of resources. So platforms internalize those three things. Now, why would it be that you would want a platform to accomplish all three of those? And the answer is, well, transactions cost. If you have to go outside, if you've ever engaged in some sort of purchase like an automobile or a car, there's other people sitting in the room and it's hard to explain why. There's lawyers, there's bankers, there's intermediaries, because you have to have outside entities to take care of this. A platform takes care of all three of these to greater or lesser extent. And as a result, it reduces the transactions cost of people exchanging. So why platforms? The resort to the market and price systems are expensive. That was Coase's basic insight in 1937. Things have gotten, in many ways, worse, not better. So expensive or inconvenient are economists' code for profit opportunity. And that's one of the things that I've come to realize is people will raise objections, oh, we can't trust each other. And when you first heard of Airbnb, you probably said, I'm going to stay in somebody else's apartment. Well, the way to solve that means if you can solve that problem, that's an opportunity for profit. So anytime you say expensive or inconvenient or something that's difficult, that's economist code for a profit opportunity. And I mean every problem. So every objection that you can think about, there are entrepreneurs around the world trying to think of that of a solution to that problem. So when I talk about platforms, people often say, well, that will never work. We would need firms to handle that. Well, maybe. But remember that Coase thought that the optimal size of the firm would depend on the cost of using the market. And if costs of using the market because of eBay or being able to purchase online and having reputations on somewhere like Amazon where I can rely on promises, optimal firm size could shrink down to almost just one individual. So every problem that you can think of is actually a profit opportunity. Every problem is an invitation for institutional innovation. And that's the Northian insight, is that institutional innovations drive a lot of political and economic progress. They also cause a lot of political and economic problems. That's the flip side, because change is just disruptive. So let's think of the difference between traditional and platform firms. Traditional firms mostly manage a balancing of division of labor and transactions costs because they want to deliver a product or service. They make money by delivering the product or service. Transactions costs mean that part of the benefit to selling this is being dissipated. If people have to line up, they'll pay less money. Platform firms are just selling reductions in transactions costs. For the most part, this fosters peer-to-peer division of labor. Now that's a different thing. I have a widget, you want a widget, and there's some intermediary, we'll call it eBay. They don't care about the widget. They don't need to know anything about it. They are a platform on which that widget is exchanged between a buyer and a seller. So they have no direct role in participating. Individuals are transacting. The platform provides a location, a virtual or physical location for that transaction to take place. So platform firms allow people to manage things and services. So Uber, for example, is not a taxi company. What Uber does is allow me, if I have a car in a few minutes and you need a ride, we can find each other. That means that there's a peer-to-peer transaction that's enabled by a platform. So when you think about it, these are ancient. The Souq of ancient Sumer. Suppose you have, you've worked hard, you've raised a crop of grain, and you have 30 bags of grain. Your entire livelihood is going to come down to, can I sell this grain to get enough stuff for my family? Now, it makes no sense for you to go to a place where there's a bunch of other people also selling grain. That's just competition. You should go to the middle of a large field and try to sell your grain, because then there's nobody else selling grain. Well, try that, see how it works. Go out into the middle of a field with no one else around. Grain for sale, nobody knows you're there. Only a platform can solve the problem of triangulation, transfer, and trust. And so the enormous markets where everyone took their grain to sell and they purchased other things, it was understood that this is where buyers and sellers of grain went. It was understood that you could negotiate and deliver prices, and there was at least rudimentary security around the Souq and on the main roads leading away. So a Souq is a primitive platform. The Sears, or in the UK, Littlewoods mail order catalog is a kind of physical platform. So if I lived in a small town in Illinois in 1890, 1900, the Sears catalog shows up. My hardware store has maybe 30 items for sale. The Sears catalog had 8,000 things for sale. So the result was that I could buy things from almost anywhere and almost anyone. The Sears catalog provided me the information. They had a way of purchasing, and if I didn't like it, I could return it. So the Sears catalog was a platform. The result was that Sears did not make most of the things that they sold. They were just a platform where sellers and buyers could find each other. The modern shopping mall, which is now disappearing, or department store, those are big buildings with many different shelves or places where you can sell different stuff. Those are platforms. Amazon famously started out as a bookstore, but they realized that the value proposition was not selling books. The value proposition was the software that allowed people to triangulate, to transfer, and to trust. So I can make purchases, I can find reviews, I can return it, and I can get transportation. The Amazon then is a platform, but it doesn't have to be an economic platform. Wikipedia, likewise, is a platform. Wikipedia is a place where people can find other people who are interested in very, very specific topics. They can contribute to the activity, and it is within reason, it is trustworthy, because Wikipedia has a very low transactions cost means of correcting mistakes. If someone goes in and changes my Wikipedia page, Michael Munger's Wikipedia page, and puts in a bunch of clown pictures, the person who edits that page, all they have to do is press one button, revert. All of those changes, all the time that this hacker spent trying to ruin my web page, one button, revert, means that we're now back to the previous language. So Wikipedia is a platform that solves all three of those transaction cost problems. Tool libraries. Tool libraries are a means of sharing, because I have a esoteric kind of wood saw. You have a different kind of wood saw. We like to make furniture. We don't have to own all of this equipment. We're all in the library and we can share. I can reserve all of these, and I have access to, in effect, a very nice woodworking shop, even if I own only one tool. Now, we have to schedule that so that I get access between 10 and 12 on Saturday, and you want it between 14 and 16 on Saturday. But that's what tool libraries do. Tool libraries are online open source software that allow us to share. We don't share by all owning things at the same time. We share them by owning things in sequence. So we serially share these items. And so a tool library is also a platform. If I return the thing, say it's a drill, it also has some electronics in it that says this is how it was damaged and at what time. It has a timestamp. It means that you can be held responsible for damaging this shared tool, and you'll be held responsible for it. You have a reputation, and we have maybe money that's held in escrow against damages. So platforms are much broader than just economic cooperation. All sorts of cooperation are going to be enabled by platforms. So the themes of the book, the biggest one is the commodification of excess capacity. If we can make excess capacity modular so that we can trade it, we've changed the nature of things. There's a shift from owning to renting, and far fewer but more durable products, specifically those that are designed to be shared. But I put shared in quotes because we're not sharing it in the usual way. Sharing is serial sole ownership managed by platforms. Now, notice that surge pricing is something that we often observe with platforms and that people complain about. But when you think about it, surge pricing is everywhere because cost is always the sum of the money price and the transaction cost. So if Starbucks were to cut its money price in London, there's already a long line, the line would just get longer. The total cost would be about the same. To the extent that we can monetize queuing costs, we reduce deadweight losses and make it more efficient because then people are trying to find ways to reduce the price even more. So the platform economy monetizes queuing costs. Surge pricing is more obvious for that reason because we don't notice that we don't have to stand in line. If you want an Uber on a rainy night, the price is probably twice the normal, but you don't have to wait for a taxi. It's already there. For some reason, that's controversial, and I'd be interested to know why people think that is. People would rather stand in line than pay a slightly higher money price. And that's a problem that the sharing economy has in a way because people object. Now, there are some problems. Transactions cost problems are basically jobs. So many service jobs are just ways for human beings to solve transactions cost problems. Platforms are a kind of change called saltation, where we leap over a bunch of activities that until now have been important. One of the interesting ones in London is that the London black cabs, in order to drive a black cab, you had to have the knowledge. That is, you had to have detailed knowledge of the location and route to all sorts of different, to any address and to different tourist activities. But if you have GPS with Waze, you can just use your phone and you can know that there was an accident 10 minutes ago where someone with the knowledge would have no way of knowing that. Now, it may be that GPS with Waze is not as good as the knowledge, but it costs 2 years less to acquire. I can just get a phone with GPS. In the United States, more and more restaurants now have kiosks, or we use software to be able to buy things. So if I go into a McDonald's or almost any fast food restaurant, I don't talk to a person. I input my order on a kiosk, and the result is all of the people along there lost their jobs. So there's a foreboding analogy. Software is to service jobs as robots and automation are to manufacturing jobs. We know that robots and automation have reduced the number of manufacturing jobs. We have lost jobs to increase productivity. Software is having the same effect on service jobs. And the question is, because until now we've said, well, service jobs are going to rescue us. Maybe they aren't as good or pay as much as manufacturing jobs, but still service jobs are the hopes of the future. All sorts of jobs can be handled by platforms using software instead of human beings. And we have a response to that. Minimum wage laws, or recently in the United States, contractor versus employee laws. That is, requirements that companies that are in the sharing economy hire someone and give them benefits instead of treating them as a contractor. I understand the sentiment behind those things, but they dramatically hasten this process. That is, what happens is that software is replacing human beings. Platforms are replacing jobs. If we have minimum wages, if we force companies to treat workers as employees rather than as contractors, where you have more flexibility, that process is going to be hastened. We're making worse the very thing that we're concerned about. So the future my thoughts about the future are a lot of the definitions of economic aggregates are becoming obsolete. The value that's created by the platform economy may be hard to measure because we use gross domestic product, GDP, and that's the price of all the things we make times the amount. Well, the price of many of these things is effectively zero, but that doesn't mean they have no consumer surplus. So GDP measures are catastrophic for understanding the effects of the sharing economy. Second, economic revolutions don't care what we think of them. The Neolithic and industrial revolutions for decades, and it's maybe even a century or more, were really bad for the participants. Will the platform economy be as disruptive as those were? Remember, in 1848, when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, they looked out the window in Berlin or London or Paris and they saw fire. They saw cities on fire. Will the platform revolution be as disruptive as those? Because politically it creates problems. Our immediate difficulties then are a sense of profound economic insecurity and opportunities for political demagoguery. It may be an irresistible temptation then for Luddism. Luddism is the idea that we can just stand athwart history and maintain the existing economic structure. The problem is that the logic of the economic structure doesn't care what we think about it, and it's going to work itself out. So in 1816, Lord Byron wrote a song for the Luddites. As the Liberty lads o'er the sea, referring to the United States, bought their freedom and cheaply with blood, so we, boys, we shall die fighting or live free, and down with all kings but King Lud. Well, the United States right now, we're seeing cities on fire, and some of the immediate result was the spark that was created by the death of George Floyd. But a big part of the reason was the sense of economic insecurity that I think has been created and it's going to accelerate. It's going to get worse before it gets better. The expansion of the platform economy. So I would be interested in hearing your questions or comments. Thank you.
Well, Mike, thank you very much. That's generated a huge number of questions from me, certainly. But of course, we've got a number of people watching tonight. Can I ask you, request that you put your questions in the Q&A? We've got a number of questions, but maybe I'll start off with a few myself, which cover some of the questions that are in. The obvious question I'm going to ask you is about COVID-19 and the impact. And I'll give a quick example. At the university, I also supervise business students. And one of my students this year, she chose the topic of Airbnb and the future of Airbnb, the past, the present, and the future. And as we got through the year, and especially the last month or so, you saw her thinking on that dissertation change, particularly with the advent of COVID and how it's impacted on the sharing economy. How do you see the impact of COVID on the sharing economy? Who will be the winners and losers? And also, will this continue, any negative impact continue afterwards, or is it just a blip?
You know that part of my answer has got to start with, since that was a question, the answer is transaction costs.
Yes.
And the reason is that Airbnb means sharing apartments. And I am worried now about sharing anything where I physically touch something that's used by someone else. And that may change much of the logic of what I've been talking about. But the second level that I would put is anything that we can think of as a problem is actually a profit opportunity. Yeah. So the question is, how are people going to figure out ways to commodify excess capacity given this additional challenge? And it may set it back a bit, but the reason why I think the net effect is going to be acceleration rather than retardation of this process is that in the United States, 30 to 35% of people are actually unemployed. Another 20% at least are in jobs where they've been furloughed or they have very little, they're not going to buy anything for a long time. If they can figure out some way to share or rent something at a much lower cost, the advantages to the sharing economy and to platforms are much greater than ever before. So right now, all over the world, entrepreneurs are trying to think of the ways to hire medical personnel to say, how can we make it safe to share? So there's two effects. One is it's more dangerous to share. The other is it's more economically imperative than ever before because I don't want to own something because it's too expensive. If I can still get a use to it, entrepreneurs are going to figure this out. But the main thing is everything that we think is a problem is a profit opportunity.
Well, let me push you a bit on that. Whenever you have disruption, quite often you have, in the short term at least, winners and losers. How would you see sort of winners and losers, both in the short term, but maybe the longer term as well?
Well, the people lose. I'm very pessimistic. I have been predicting since early March that by the middle of July, the United States is going to be under martial law in the large cities, and that we will have food rationing of the Soviet sort, where you've got a truck and an armored personnel carrier with people coming up and having their ration card stamped and getting rice and beans. The supply system, the supply chain for food and a lot of other necessities in our cities is broken, and it's not going to recover anytime soon. So when I made the comparison to 1848, I was not playing. I worry that we're going to see something like the 1848 to 1850 period of profound economic disruption. And so this is not an optimistic view. My claim instead is that it's inevitable.
Okay, well, look, we've got about half an hour, so I'm going to ask the audience, please do send in your questions. And don't worry if you've already asked a question. We're not going to ration it here. We're not up against time yet. We'll share it. Exactly. And feel free to send in more questions. Don't be shy, as they say. Next question from Adam Bartha, who leads our Epicenter, which is a network of European classical liberal think tanks. And Adam asks, do social norms and the culture of ownership, especially in the US, matter more than economic efficiency? In other words, maybe people prioritize stability and reliability over costs and convenience.
That's absolutely right. And that changes one death of an old person like me at a time. So if you look at my Facebook page, I have pathetic pictures of my house and my BMW. I have a shiny black BMW. It's beautiful. I'm just the sort of asshat you think I am, driving around with that car, flashing my lights.
So you're obviously proud of your BMW, aren't you? That's what you're saying.
And I do not rent it out.
Yeah.
My son he's a professor at Penn State. He has pictures of him hang gliding in Nepal. So old people, it is true, old people value stuff, because I was raised by parents who themselves grew up during the Depression. Having the control of stuff is a status symbol, but many status symbols are socially constructed. And the fact that you are relatively free to travel for young people, until, again, this may be affected by COVID-19 in ways that are hard to predict, but not owning a bunch of stuff that has a big footprint on the environment that you have to pay to store, but rather having the freedom to be able to rent or use and then go somewhere else. Because owning a home is complicated. Today, I'm paying people to cut down a large tree that's dangerous in my lawn. It's $2,500. So the ownership is expensive and inconvenient. The reason that we own things is that, suppose I have a power drill. I value the ability to drill 2 holes in this wall right now. I don't really care about owning a power drill. I want 2 holes in this wall right now. But the least transaction cost way for me to own that is to own a drill. For me to be able to accomplish that is to be able to own a drill. Now, Adam's exactly right. We have conflated that with ownership as status. But young people, I think, are changing already. And as a result of this process working itself out, I don't think ownership is going to confer status 20 years from now in the same way that it does now. It'll seem old-fashioned, and it will seem cumbersome. You're being tied down by a bunch of belongings. So I guess I'm sort of Rousseauian on this. I tend to think that social status is partly reconstructed generationally, and I expect the next generation to be quite different. And I actually find when I give talks to young people, a lot of them will say, yes, I don't understand my parents' attachment to physical things. I care about other people and experiences.
And it does seem out there quite often when you speak to many of your students, first of all, the whole issue of materialism, and secondly, there are a number of people who are being attracted by the idea of the minimalist movement.
Yes.
And one of the questions they're asking is, do I need to own all this stuff? Which is very much in line with what you're saying.
That's a larger part of this is reducing my footprint on the environment. So if I can rent this and we can share it, and that's something that the book emphasizes quite a bit. So let me say a little something about it. Right now in the United States, there's 110 million power drills, 110 million power drills. The median lifetime use of a power drill, if you sort it from largest to smallest, the 55th millionth power drill is used between 30 and 40 minutes, lifetime. The rest of them are used less than 30 or 40 minutes. They spend their time gathering dust. They're relatively inexpensive. So we buy cheap, not very good drills. We don't use them very much, and then we pay to store them. We could probably get away, if we were to share and rent, with 6 or 7 million high quality commercial power drills where I would have better use of this tool. I would use of a better tool, and I could share it. So it means that we don't need garages, we don't need closets, and importantly in cities, we don't need parking spaces. Often in London, if you're driving, which means sitting, because you're not moving, and you look to your left, there's a whole other row of traffic that's completely occupied by cars with no people in them. We're paying to park all of these giant pieces of metal for absolutely no reason. So if we didn't have to park, we'd have a lot more space. If we didn't have to store, we'd have a lot more space. So you can reduce your impact on the environment by sharing. The problem is you will only share if the transactions cost are low enough, but the platform economy is precisely targeted on reducing the costs of transactions because people can make profits by doing that.
Yeah, and in fact, in some ways, I'm one of those people who personify that. You know, we live in London. We used to be a 2-car family. I got rid of my car, and I now, if I need a second car, I use Uber or I use Zipcar, where I rent a car for by the hour. So absolutely, yeah. So that's clearly a trend. Let's move on to the other questions. Craig Pollard asks, is Bitcoin the ultimate platform, which is to say a decentralized supranational non-fiat currency owned and controlled by no one, private and secure, a model that other platforms could emulate?
Other platforms are emulating them because Bitcoin is not only a currency, it also has a distributed ledger system called the blockchain. And so, yes, absolutely. Bitcoin, to the extent that blockchain applications can also be used, and I think I actually would separate out the blockchain and the currency functions of Bitcoin, although obviously they operate, they're integral to Bitcoin. But just blockchain itself enables a lot of different platforms. So Bitcoin is absolutely an example, and it's a clearance system because, well, suppose I want to wire you money. This is 2020. If I want to wire Professor Kamal money, I have to go to a bank, and it'll take me 20 minutes of filling out forms. It'll probably cost me 3 or 4% of the amount, and it may take a week or 10 days. Whereas Bitcoin in a phone, I can do it in 30 seconds, and he has the money available to spend within 10 minutes, 12 minutes after it takes the next block to be chained together by miners. So the exchange part, we have a system based on credit cards. Credit cards are designed to be plastic things with raised letters, and you young people have never seen this, but they used to have these machines and you'd run it back and forth with a piece of paper, and then you'd have a physical copy that would say, this is my receipt. So the credit cards are designed to be used in an analog world. They're imperfectly adapted to the virtual world, but Bitcoin is the first virtual cash system that's made explicitly for that purpose. And the trust component that Craig mentions is really important because the blockchain part of that, it's easy to forget how expensive it is to achieve trust. And in a way, it's a problem with Bitcoin because if I give you money, you've got it. It's hard to refund it. It's just like cash. And so we have to have other mechanisms of making sure that we can pay it. Bitcoin needs to operate in a system where we have other ways of assuring trust because it's irreversible. But there are other ways. There's reviews, there's all sorts of systems that when we combine them with Bitcoin will constitute a platform. So Bitcoin, a lot of Bitcoin is a turnkey platform creation device. Craig is right.
Well, thank you for suggesting the idea of wiring money to us at the IEA. And we're able to produce programs like this for free, thanks to the generosity of our donors. So if anyone would like to help us keep all our content free, please go to our website, www.iea.org.uk, where you can make a donation. online. You don't have to via Bitcoin. If you're international, you can also use TransferWise or any other international transfer service. Thank you for that advert, Mike. Let's move on to the next one. Andy Mayer says, what does COVID-19 mean for the transaction costs of attending the office and how they're perceived in the future? We've seen organizations like WeWork and others. What's the impact?
I know that I don't know that. And one of the things that's interesting about being a professor in this space, I often think I'll have an idea, and I have quickly decided the difference between a professor and an entrepreneur is about 5 years. Anything I can think of, an entrepreneur thought of 5 years ago. But like any biological system, when you get a substantial change in the environment, you may get a difference in the optimizing response. So WeWork was a way of providing physical space. Zoom is a way of sharing meetings, but online. So WeWork has plummeted, Zoom has gone up. So we're going to see a period of adjustment. I do think we'll never go back to the number of face-to-face meetings and talks. Because when you think about it, there was a lot of dead weight losses. Suppose that because we were very happy at the prospect of the release of this book, and I am proud to be able to work for the IEA, where every aspect of my working with them has been great. I might very well have flown over to London on Sunday night. I would have gotten there Monday morning. I would have taken yesterday to recover. We would have done this in person. Maybe we would have rented the Royal Geographic Society space, and it would have been a big to-do. And it would have cost me 3 days. It would have cost people dozens of hours collectively to go and sit and wait, whereas we can accomplish this now much more simply. So I wonder if this is going to change people's taste for in-person activities to the extent that software can reduce the transactions cost of being able to do something like this online. So, and the fact that there also are safety reasons for doing it. Apparently there was a survey, about 12% of jobs in the United States were remote. More than 50% of firms are now saying that they'll have remote workers even after the end of COVID. And the reason is, and this is one of the themes of my book, you can monetize queuing costs. Queuing costs include getting ready, going to the office, coming back from the office, and the fact that there is an office. It's expensive to have all of this really expensive real estate in the city, in the financial part of London. There's some gigantically some of the most expensive real estate in the world. It is there for offices for people to sit in. You can sit somewhere much cheaper and interact over something electronic. So physical space for offices, because we now have an existence proof that there are other cheaper ways to interact, mean that we're going to see software monetize queuing costs. So we're eliminating deadweight losses, and you and I can split. I can have a slightly higher salary, my employer can have slightly higher productivity, and we get rid of all those queuing and transportation costs. So I think it's going to be a fundamental change, but remember, anything I can think of somebody else thought of 5 years ago. So I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that there's going to be fundamental change.
We are, Mike. Oh, sorry, we lost you there. But we've got you back. And as you say, that was more than one issue there. One is it wasn't only about WeWork, but it's the fact that it will impact on legacy office space.
Yes.
Will companies when they go back, will they want as much office space as they had in the past?
It's incredibly expensive.
Yeah, exactly. And we could see a lot of firms, as you say, not only allowing their workers to work remotely, but even a sort of hybrid where they'll say you can come in for certain times, but you won't necessarily have your own desk. More a combination of both. Right, let's move on. Tom Packer asks something which is really interesting. With any technology, you always have the issue, first of all, that regulators are behind the technology. Secondly, that they tend to regulate a new service when they catch up in line with the legacy systems. And particularly when you have disruption, you have winners and losers. The losers will lobby for regulation as well. Putting all those together, I think leads to Tom Packer's question, is how do we stop government regulating these new platforms out of existence, given the interests that are hurt?
There's a fundamental political problem. And that is the workers who now work in an industry that by economic logic should be shrinking. vote based on that interest. The consumers who would benefit and the workers who would be employed in jobs that don't yet exist can't possibly vote on that interest. And so there is an asymmetry of the Mansur-Olson sort, where you've got concentrated interests that have the ear of government regulators. And so I've been interested to see how that has worked out in the United States on attempts to regulate Uber and Airbnb. And there are problems with Uber and Airbnb. I can understand it, but the solution should be get rid of the regulations on the legacy carriers, not add new regulations to compensate on Uber. So the city of Miami, for example, tried to impose a regulation on Uber that said, and I'm not making this up, Uber cannot pick up for at least 20 minutes after receiving a call.
Yeah.
And the reason was the taxis suck so hard that they cannot manage to pick you up for at least 20 minutes. And to make the playing field level, then they said, all right, Uber, you have to suck too. You also have to wait at least 20. That's crazy. That's putting your thumb on the scale of progress. On the other hand, if you want to say you have to have a special driver's license to drive a taxi, you can have that level of skill for Uber drivers also. That is more of an equating. But if it wasn't really necessary, why not get rid of it in the first place? A lot of occupational licensing is actually explicitly designed and certainly has the effect of increasing rents for people who are in the industry. It benefits the people in the industry at the cost of consumers and at the cost of preventing innovation. So I agree with Tom that this is a problem. But what happened in Miami? There was consumer outcry saying, why? Why would you do that? So voters are going to drive this process. Just as there's consumer sovereignty in economics, there's voter sovereignty in democracies. And this process of the establishment of platform is well enough established now that attempts to regulate it tend to get thwarted at the ballot box. But you're absolutely right, Tom. I believe that it will delay and it will impose costs, but that's the reason that I bring up Luddism. So the Ned Ludd people thought that by destroying the power looms, with throwing stones at them, by breaking the power looms, they could preserve their jobs. And it's just a broken window fallacy. You don't make things by destroying them. So the difficulty is, and that's one of the reasons that I was pleased to get to write this book, why I try to go give talks on Zoom and talk to groups of consumers and voters as much as I can. If people recognize that, you might say it's hopeless, but it's inevitable. The fact that it's economically cheaper and better means that we're going to have to worry about solving the political problems, because the economic problem is solved. Platforms are the answer.
Yeah, and sometimes also, as you say, it's not just the lobbying, if you like, from the interests that have been hurt, but the regulators generally don't understand how to regulate this new industry. So, as you say, Uber would see itself, and many others would see it as a platform. Traditional regulators would see it as a taxi company,
yes,
and say, let's regulate it as a taxi company. And then you have the other side, which is the backlash from the producers that are hurt. So, for example, in London, and I know a number of other cities, they're starting to limit the amount of time that people could rent out their rooms, for example.
yes.
And does that offer us an opportunity? Those of us who are classically liberal, libertarian, quite often we're worried about a lot of young people being seduced by modern liberalism and socialism. But at the same time, their behavior suggests that they welcome this sort of new one freedom from the sharing economy. Does that offer us an opportunity?
Well, I think it does, because young people are quite skeptical of some of these restrictions. And I have to say that I'm very gratified by this in looking at some of the protests against Airbnb in, for example, San Francisco. San Francisco, California has some of the most expensive real estate in the United States. And Airbnb has taken to, someone would buy up an entire building and then rent it out, basically running a hotel, but using Airbnb to do it. And so the answer of the San Francisco City Council was to say, no, you can't do that. You can't rent it out for more than a month or maybe a week. You have to actually live there. Well, the question is, why is there such a housing shortage in San Francisco? And the answer is that these neighborhoods have resisted any kind of affordable housing being built. They use zoning restrictions to prevent new housing from being built in that neighborhood. And so I often will go and give talks to conventions of urban planners. And urban planners are not necessarily the people you expect to be most susceptible to the classical liberal message. But the two things they hate, and I've had standing ovations. First, parking. San Francisco requires 1.7 parking spaces to be provided at the expense of the developer for each housing unit. Well, that's incredibly expensive. That's subsidizing cars. Second, the restrictions that zoning places saying you can't have anything smaller than 1,200 square feet, which is a pretty large apartment. That means that you can only have expensive apartments. If you get rid of parking restrictions and you get rid of minimum size restrictions, San Francisco wouldn't have a housing problem, and Airbnb wouldn't be a problem. The reason Airbnb is a problem, it's because these other regulations are being exposed. The artificial housing shortage means that Airbnb can take advantage by arbitraging. The solution, and a lot of young people, a lot of urban planners in the United States, the people that are coming out of planning schools with degrees, they're on our side. They're on my side on this. Get rid of parking requirements and get rid of minimum space requirements, and the market will begin to handle some of those difficulties. So the answer is not regulate Airbnb. The answer is deregulate housing.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got about 7 questions. So what I'm going to ask viewers to do is to help me out here by going to the Q&A function and voting on those questions that you think ought to be asked. And let's see how the league table ends at the end, as it were. So, and don't worry, there are no playoffs. It just gets us. It's just the end of the season. Next question from Chirag Atre. I apologise if I've mispronounced your name. What is your view on the situation in the US? No, sorry. Why is your view of the situation in the US so pessimistic when other countries have been able to deal with supply chain shocks and surges in demand due to panic buying successfully?
I don't think the problem is intrinsic. I think the problem is political. And since 2016, and if you are Donald Trump fans, forgive me, I'm not really a Donald Trump fan. I see the potential for political demagoguery of identifying outsiders or bad people. And in the case of the United States, there's a long tradition of nativism, which is odd for a place that's entirely immigrants. My people came to the United States from County Surrey in England in 1651, but that was a long time ago. So I'm an immigrant family. A lot of immigrants are coming to the United States, but we think that's enough. And demagogues saying the problem, the reason you're losing your job is these immigrants, means that we're going to have riots. We're going to have something approximating race war, because the temptation for political demagoguery is irresistible. I think we can handle the problem economically, as I said. Our problem is political. So I hope I'm wrong about that. But with 30% unemployment and no prospect, because the cities are still locked down, of people being able to get jobs and losing their savings, losing their livelihood, not being able to pay their rent, they're going to be angry. And someone's going to come up with a political solution. Those are bad people. Go after them. So I'm worried about politics, not economics.
Okay, next question from Professor Martin Ricketts, who's the chairman of our Academic Advisory Council, and also an expert in terms of transaction costs and the theory of the firm, and has written the textbook, The Economics of Business Enterprise, an introduction to economic organization and the theory of the firm, which for many people is the go-to textbook when it comes to on a number of university courses. So Martin, having a big job enough, I'm now going to share your question. It says, thanks, Michael, great talk. Critics claim that the new market-making platforms are more effective the more users they attract, and are therefore part of the winner-takes-all phenomenon, which they say characterizes the modern world. There are calls to regulate them, partly on the grounds that they evolve into natural monopolies and have similarities with public utilities. For example, Lena Khan's 2017 paper on Amazon in the Yale Law Journal. Do you have any sympathy with this approach, or would you argue that the Schumpeterian entrepreneurs will eventually think of new ways of challenging any dominant incumbent?
Darn it, Professor Ricketts says, hello, Martin, it's good to see you.
The answer is transaction costs, by the way.
Yeah, but that's such a great question. Let me give a 1-minute answer. My first job out of graduate school was at the Federal Trade Commission. We're one of the antitrust authorities of the United States. A lot of people say that Facebook and other large platforms are an antitrust problem and they should be broken up. But Professor Ricketts' question shows precisely why that is a mistake. The reason there's one Facebook is all of us want to be able to share our cat videos on one platform. I want to be able to show you my cat and my dog. And so we have just one platform. What is the price of Facebook? They don't charge anything. So the usual antitrust story is monopoly prices are too high. The problem with these large companies is that entry barriers are very difficult. Suppose you had an idea about a new way of renting out houses like Airbnb. It was a better way of renting out houses like Airbnb. So you start this up and it's better software. You get no customers because Airbnb has a large inventory of reviews of buyers and sellers. And so Professor Ricketts' point is perfect. It constitutes an entry barrier in the old way of thinking about antitrust, but the old solution in antitrust of breaking them up won't work. This is an unsolved problem, but yes, I am absolutely sympathetic to this because the idea that innovation can always solve this problem of concentration, that may be true in the long run, but it's not clear to me that politically we're going to be able to say, no, you should not regulate these large companies that are so economically dominant that they can't be challenged. And it's the logic of the network economy itself. It's a logic of the platform economy itself, as Professor Ricketts suggests, that makes this such a difficult problem. So that's a great question. I hope you can solve it.
And it's one of those great questions that you'll expect from Martin Ricketts. So next one is Barry McClare Cullinane. Barry, good to see you today. I haven't seen you for a long time, but I think I've seen many people for a long time, given lockdown. Given the speed of innovation disruption created by platforms, will we see an evolution of customary norms, law and legal institutions to resolve disputes on platforms? And will the state, and in brackets, and legislation, be left behind?
I certainly think that, but I'm an economist. I'm better at predicting the past, and the immediate past is my specialty. Tomorrow I can predict with great accuracy. But it does seem like a way of reducing the transactions cost of using the court system would be to have some mutually agreed upon way of negotiating and adjudicating disputes. So something like the law merchants of the Middle Ages. So private adjudication of disputes where you specialize, you have a reputation, this guy was really fair. He not that he found in my side, but he was really fair. We might write those into contracts. Also, Bitcoin means that if you can write a smart contract, so my next book is going to be about smart contracts and blockchain. Smart contracts have internal intelligence that may be able to discover a set of if-then conditions that make a lot of the disputes irrelevant. So I think software generally and blockchain in particular may help get around what until now have been done by these large, cumbersome, lethargic institutions like banks and attorneys and regulatory agencies. So yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay, I've got one longer question and I've got three short questions. Let's see if we can get through them all. Anonymous attendee says, do you think that large vertically integrated firms as we have known them will start to disappear? And do you think we will see the end of the retail industry as we know it? Will firms be able to justify owning commercial property anymore?
I don't think the retail industry will disappear, but it will shrink dramatically. And I think the way to think about this is when movies first came along, people in live theater thought it would be the end. But right now in New York, within a few blocks, you can see live theater and you can see a movie theater. So the two things may exist side by side, but retail is going to have to change. They're going to have to offer a more personal experience. And forgive me, what was the first part of the question?
Will we see large vertically integrated firms disappear?
Oh, right. Yes, and that's Kosa's insight, is that if you can reduce transactions cost of obtaining things cheaply and reliably, I don't need to own my supply chain. And so the result is that firms will get smaller.
Right. I've got three quick questions. Is it possible to calculate the number or percentage of service jobs that will be lost to software?
All of them.
Okay. Next one is, I think it's aimed at me and you. When will Professor Munger's book be published? We are going to agree on a date once we are more certain about the end of lockdown. but I think that's the answer. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then the last question is, do you know who coined the phrase the sharing economy and when?
I don't know, and if any of the listeners know and can post it on Q&A, I would appreciate it, because that tends to be the sort of thing, if we can crowdsource it, if any, because I don't know who came up with the idea of the sharing economy. I did research it and I found several different stories. It's an interesting question. I don't know.
And I suspect it is like many of these phrases where if you Google who came up with the phrase, lots of people would have claimed that they will all share in the credit, as it were. So to take that. Well, thank you for watching this video. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London. Follow our podcasts on Podbean, or visit our website at iea.org.uk, where you can also sign up for our IEA newsletter, IEA Daily, and find more information on the IEA Book Club.